Great. So good evening, everyone. I'm going to get started. My name is Jennifer March, and I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Committee for Children. And I thank everyone for joining us for this panel discussion, Reducing Child Poverty, Transformational Tax Policy Reforms in the American Rescue Plan. Before I introduce my guest speakers, I wanted to share a little bit of history to offer context on why CCC is so excited to gather with all of you this evening. You may or may not know that Citizens Committee for Children has a long-standing history of championing tax policy reforms to combat child poverty and put children and families on a path toward upward mobility to financial stability and security. In fact, in the 1960s, CCC advocated at the national level for a universal children's allowance, sponsoring a national conference called Children's Allowances. And we published from that conference the Children's Allowance and the Economic Welfare of Children. And to advance that work nationally, we also released 19 million children counted out, the latest figures on child poverty and why we need a children's allowance in the United States. So obviously, while our efforts in the 60s did not result in a child allowance at that time, we continued to be robust supporters of tax policy as a vehicle through which to lift incomes and combat poverty. In 2004, we played an instrumental role in the creation of New York City's Earned Income Tax Credit, which provides a refundable tax credit to over 800,000 low-income families each year. And building on this effort in 2007, we also informed the creation of the first municipal level child independent care credit in the nation. New York City's child independent care credit reaches about 20,000 households annually. In previous years, notably, it reached about 50,000 households, and it provides families with a refund of up to $1,000 to help offset caregiving costs. And then furthermore, 16 years ago, we proposed that the city create a child savings account for every baby born in New York City. And that proposal led to numerous conversations with appointed officials in the Bloomberg administration and the de Blasio administration around the idea of universal savings options for New York City families and their children, and informed the development of a child savings pilot program underway in Queens and run by New York City Kids Rise, a local nonprofit. And last but not least, with our partners at the Financial Clinic and the New York Asset Development Coalition, we advanced and secured state legislation in 2016 that makes accumulating assets and savings easier for families by enabling New Yorkers to split their tax refund and direct a portion to either a 529 or other savings vehicle at tax time. And we know this option is particularly important for low-income families who at tax time receive the EITC refunds, which often comprise nearly 40% of their entire income. So this history is important context setting for today's discussion because many of you have heard or read about the American Rescue Plan and its inclusion of reforms of the federal level earned income tax credit, child independent care credit, and the child tax credit to put more income in the pockets of Americans at a time when job loss and declining incomes have harmed so many and child poverty is on the rise. So today we're here with our colleagues to better understand how the creation of a child allowance through reforms of the federal child tax credit will impact children nationally, as well as in New York State and New York City. And it's my hope that this is the first of many discussions in which we can explore how to make the federal child allowance permanent and more inclusive, but also how we can explore building on these efforts to combat child poverty here in New York State and New York City. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. Joining us from Columbia University's Center on Poverty and Social Policy, we have Chris Weimer, who's the co-director of the center, where his work focuses on measurement of poverty and disadvantage, as well as the role that anti-poverty policies play in the lives of low-income individuals and families. He is also the project director of the Robin Hood Poverty Tracker, which assesses the dynamics of poverty and disadvantage in New York City. He's joined by his colleague, Sophie Collier, who is a research director who works closely with the data from the Robin Hood Poverty Tracker to assess the dynamics of poverty and disadvantage in New York City. She also evaluates anti-poverty policies at the national and local level, with a particular interest in the child tax credit and federal and local minimum wage policy. And then we also have Megan Curran, who's a postdoctoral research scientist whose research explores policy strategies for child poverty reduction with an emphasis on federal income supports, poverty targets, and cross-national learning. Her recent work on how COVID-19 economic relief efforts impact children and families also examines the ways in which a regularly delivered child allowance can support children through the immediate crisis and beyond. So Chris, Sophie, and Megan, we're really incredibly grateful that you're here with us today. And I will just say before I turn it over to you, for those that you are listening, I'm going to facilitate a conversation with Chris, Sophie, and Megan, and I'm going to pause at 2 distinct points in time where I can explore questions in the chat, and then we'll have a moment at the end to ask additional questions as well. So Chris and Megan, I'd like to start by turning to you to provide an overview of the Center on Policy and Social Policy and what you found in your research about how the child tax credit reforms in the American Rescue Plan will help to move the needle in reducing child poverty. Chris?
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you for having myself and Megan and Sophie to join you today. You won't hear a ton from me. I'm going to turn it over to Megan fairly quickly, but just to set the stage a little bit, I co-direct the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University at the School of Social Work there, and we have done a lot of work trying to understand the effects of anti-poverty policies and programs on low-income Americans. And we have sort of 2 streams of research, one focused specifically on New York City, mostly built around our Robin Hood poverty tracker work, which I'll talk about a little later in the day. And then one looking at sort of federal and state anti-poverty policies and the role they play in reducing poverty and other forms of disadvantage in the country. And so historically, yeah, you can stay there. Historically, we've tried to reassess long-term trends in poverty using an improved measure of poverty, which is called the Supplemental Poverty Measure. And key to the Supplemental Poverty Measure is that it corrects some of the long-standing and known deficiencies in official poverty statistics that come out every year. So the official poverty line was developed in the 1960s, is around $25,000 for a family of 4. But critically, like, doesn't count a lot of the resources that the government directs toward low-income families, especially low-income families with children. So it doesn't count things that come through in-kind benefits like food stamps, SNAP, WIC, school meals, housing assistance, et cetera. And then also doesn't count things that are delivered through the tax code, which we're going to focus on here today. So the major expansions to the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit. So we're about to embark on a real experiment in American social policy with the expansion of the current child tax credit to more of a monthly child allowance. And Megan will talk a bit about that, but it's important to know that that would never show up in a reduction in poverty under the official measure. And so moving to the supplemental measure, which we use in pretty much most to all of our analyses, captures these after-tax resources and in-kind benefits. It also accounts for the higher cost of living in places like New York City, which we'll discuss along the way. But we've, after understanding the long-term trends in poverty, we're really trying to, in the past few years, really try to understand the potential impacts of changes to social policies and how that might affect American families, families with children, et cetera. And in doing so, we've recently released some analyses of the American Rescue Plan and its likely impacts. And I think that's what we're mostly going to talk about today. And so with that, I will turn it over to Megan, and she can share some of our recent research on the topic.
Great, thanks very much, Chris, and thanks again, Jennifer. So you can advance to the next slide. So just to give a little bit more context about, so Chris talked about the fact that we use what's called the Supplemental Poverty Measure because it's a really nice tool for capturing the impact of policy. And I'll just give a really quick overview of the different ways that the Center on Poverty and Social Policy has been trying to assess poverty most recently during the pandemic. The sort of traditional way that we look at poverty is, over the course of a whole year. So we talk about what did poverty look like in 2019, but we actually only measure that about a year later because we kind of have to wait for the data to come in from the census to try and understand what is the whole sort of package of resources that a family had on an annual basis. So that's sort of, imperfect in normal times because, we don't necessarily get real-time information. But we know that obviously the last sort of year has been just, far from normal. And so we have been trying to think about different ways to try and get at what's actually happening to families now. So two things led by our colleague, Zach Parolin in particular, spearheaded much of this, and our whole team has been trying to fine tune it over the past year, is looking at what is happening actually to families on a monthly basis, because we know that over the course of the pandemic, how families were faring really actually kind of mattered what month you were talking about. So January and February of 2020 was, pretty much the same as it was in 2019. But as soon as you got to March and April, we had, severe job losses, but then also the introduction of things like the pieces of the CARES Act, like the stimulus checks, expansions of unemployment and things like that. When those went away again later in 2020, we saw poverty rise again on a monthly basis. So trying to track things monthly has been really useful tool, but they are estimates. What we are also trying to do is then also try and get a sense of, okay, well, what does 2021 potentially look like as a whole for the year? And this is what, we've tried to do in terms of projecting some real-time estimates that account for this, massive new package with the American Rescue Plan. And, what do things like this new child tax credit mean potentially in the short term? So if you could advance the slide. Again, just to kind of point you, we have a couple of resources on our website if you want to learn more. But when we try to chart things monthly, you can see with the sort of very bottom line there on that bigger graph that, policy makes a difference, essentially, that, the different forms of relief that have come in over the past year from Congress basically staved off what could have been some of the worst increases in poverty that we've seen in, 50 years or more. And, there is a lot of real potential about the American Rescue Plan. And we will continue to try and chart what happens on a monthly basis once some of these, new stimulus payments really hit families' bank accounts, and what actually happens with this new, more regularly delivered child tax credit. So you can kind of keep an eye on our website and see how this continues to unfold over the course of this year. You can advance the slide. But to talk, kind of more specifically about things that you probably, can't really even escape in the news these days is what people are talking about in terms of this huge new plan that just passed Congress very recently and signed into law by President Biden. So this is where our sort of that third component of poverty assessment comes into play when we're trying to estimate what's happening this year in 2021. The bill itself is huge. But we did an estimate taking kind of like the top 6 direct income components that would really sort of make a real difference for family incomes in the short term. Increases in SNAP, the new stimulus payments, unemployment insurance, in particular, the new child tax credit, but also expansions to the earned income tax credit and the child and dependent care credit. So taken all together, you may have seen some headlines recently that all of these things in combination, have a potentially really significant impact on child poverty this year. When we look at these things all together, we project that it could potentially keep close to 6 million children from poverty in 2021, a figure which essentially amounts to a reduction of child poverty by just over 50% or half of what it could have been absent these provisions. Now, achieving the potential that this bill has is really, part and parcel of it is the fact that families have to receive actually what they're now eligible for. And so, we fielded a number of questions of, which of these components is the most important one for having child poverty, or which, what role does the child tax credit in particular play? And we're going to, talk about the child tax credit in particular, a lot more detail. But, in terms of trying to isolate things, it's really kind of a bit of a chicken and egg, situation. In other words, it depends really what you're counting first. If families are a few $1,000s below the poverty line, if you count the new child tax credit first, then that kind of could be what moves them over. But if you count the stimulus checks, maybe that does it. So it's important to think that these things are working in tandem to really help families. And that, they are all needed because, families are experiencing all different things, all different types of crises during this pandemic. And, poverty is only one piece of it, but we do know that from, pre-pandemic times that the child tax credit, with some significant reforms like the ones that are put in this package, could do quite a lot for reducing child poverty. You can advance the slide. And so if we just look at the next slide, when it's up, we can see, just what are these pieces that we know in normal times could have done quite a lot for child poverty, and what has been, what has been rolled into the new child tax credit that's in place for the next year. Basically, we're seeing three big things. There's an increase in benefit levels. So, right now there's a potential maximum. Prior to this law being passed, there was a potential maximum of $2,000 per child. This is now increased. The new maximum is for children under 6 could receive an annual maximum benefit of $3,600. For children aged 6 to 17, that's now a $3,000 maximum. It's now fully available to children with the lowest incomes. This is a change that Sophie will talk about shortly. So now, from $0 in earnings up to over $100,000, families can receive the maximum benefit. And the newest and one of the most kind of exciting and transformational things about this is that rather than being paid out once a year in tax time as a sort of just deduction of the taxes you owe or a bit of a refund, it's actually now going to be paid out in regular installments. We're hoping that this means monthly, but again, implementation is key. But what it could mean, if you thought about it on a monthly basis, is actually very young kids could see $300 payment per child per month on average. And older children could see $250 per child per month. So all of these are really important pieces, and happy to talk about them further in the questions and a bit more of the discussion. But it's also just important that with all of these new achievements, they are temporary, so folks will be kind of having an eye on what might become permanent. But it's also important to point out that it still doesn't capture every child. We're still missing out, very importantly, for some children in immigrant families if the children don't have Social Security numbers. And when we get to implementation and things, we want to make sure that kids, no matter kind of how complex their family circumstances are, can still be reached by this. So there's lots of work to do, but we're at a really exciting point in that we now have a sort of temporary piece that is, much more generous and just a really much more meaningful benefit for families. And so I'll leave it there and turn it back to you, Jennifer, if you wanted to talk in any of these pieces in a little more detail.
Thanks. I wanted just to press you and Chris a little bit as we think about hopefully making this child allowance permanent and more inclusive. What types of things are you going to be looking at in your research to help advocates and yourselves make the case over time?
Yes, Chris can jump in, but I think I'll say quickly, evidence is important, evidence matters. And so, we'll be trying to do what we can with things like our monthly poverty measurements to try and see how that might make a difference in terms of maybe kind of smoothing what is sometimes some income volatility for families. We saw in our monthly poverty measure from last year that, around kind of March, April, when the traditional child tax credit and earned income tax credit refunds would come in, if you're just talking about monthly poverty, it actually declined quite a bit because, there's a sort of influx of cash here. But then it spikes back up immediately afterwards. And that's not great for families who obviously have regular bills and, regular expenses and that they're trying to support their kids. And so what's exciting to us is the potential to maybe see some of this sort of smoothing, that if we pay this out on a regular basis, we could see a difference for families' sort of income stability over the year. But we're also excited to try and work with other folks who have different types of surveys in the field that might be able to capture kind of families' real-time experiences What are they spending it on? How are they feeling? Is it reducing stress? Is it reducing hardship, hunger, things like that? We know that this happens in other countries, that there are these really positive benefits. And so, trying to get a sense of what the data can tell us here will be really useful.
That's great. And I know you mentioned as well when we were preparing for the panel that there is some concern about how do we reach people that may not have filed taxes previously, or even people that might not have bank accounts. So implementation will be key.
Implementation, it will be key because, our research kind of says what the potential child poverty could be if children and families receive what they're now eligible for. We know implementation is tricky. The U.S. is a big country, and the IRS has been really busy over the past year because they're paying out extra stimulus checks and things like that, in addition to just regular tax time. So, implementation is not, a sort of automatic, easy thing to overcome, but I think it's definitely doable. But it's also worth, anyone who is listening here who works, in New York City or New York State or in neighboring areas, who work directly with families, to get the word out that, in the short term, the easiest and most efficient way for families to access it is to file a federal tax return. It doesn't matter if you owe anything to the government, but if you just file the return, the IRS will have your information and you can be connected to this benefit when it starts rolling out in July. If anyone's connected to, the sort of VITA sites or free tax preparation assistance services, community groups, anything like that, it's kind of getting the word out and also just helping families who might not be familiar with the filing system. Maybe they haven't earned enough in the past to have to owe taxes, just to try and get them connected in the short term until maybe some new, easier access pieces can be unrolled.
That's really neat to think about. So I'm going to turn now to Sophie, and I wondered if you could help us understand who was left out of the child tax credit before this reform, and whether or not there are any gaps remaining in the recent federal stimulus or opportunities to be more inclusive at the state level.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. So in response to your question, actually about 1/3 of children across the country were ineligible for the full child tax credit under prior law. So you might ask, like, how is that possible? And it has to do with the fact that it was tied to your earnings. So in the figure on the left, we actually show, what credit different families were eligible for based on their income and their family size. So income is on the bottom and the child tax credit value is on the vertical axis. And the first important point is that families with earnings below $2,500 were completely ineligible for the child tax credit before the recent law was, the recent ARP expansion. It also then began to phase in with income. So that slanted line shows how, as your incomes increased, your credit value increased. But you needed about $30,000 in income to qualify for the full credit if you had one child and you were a joint filer. Now, if you had more children, you were actually penalized and you needed, for example, $42,000 in earned income to qualify for the full credit with 3 children. Now, this structure altogether made it such that 1/3 of children were left behind when it came to receiving the full credit, and 10%, 1 in 10 children across the country received no credit at all. We also see that Black and Latino children were disproportionately left behind and left out of this credit, and more than 50% of kids in these groups received a partial credit or no credit. So it was really, leaving out the children who would benefit from it the most. And the reforms in the ARP that Megan was discussing address this real gap in the credit that existed in prior law. And if we could advance to the next slide, please. Just so you have the New York City numbers, about 36% of children in New York State were left out of the full CTC under the prior law. And we examined rates of partial and non-receipt in congressional districts. and found that about 68% of children in New York's 15th district, which is on the map on the right and covers part of the Bronx, 68% of children in this district received a partial credit or no credit. And that was the highest rate of kind of being left out of this credit across all congressional districts in the country. We have, mapped all of the congressional districts on our website. So if you're interested in checking that out, there's a link in the PowerPoint. We can share it later.
That's incredible when you think of that's, I think, the poorest congressional district in the country.
Yeah, exactly. So, when you do a geographic analysis, what you're finding is that the districts, high poverty districts, are districts where more kids are left behind. And it's really kind of the inverse of what one might hope for or expect. But the way that the law was structured was made this the reality. So yeah, if we could advance the slide, please. Now, Megan discussed, the combined impact of all of the components of the American Rescue Plan. But here we're just examining the impact of something called the American Family Act, which the expansions to the child tax credit in the ARP are really modeled on. So they decouple in the American Family Act, the credit is decoupled from earnings, and the credit values are increased to those that are in the American Rescue Plan. This bill was introduced in the Senate by Senators Brown and Bennett, and then also in the House by Representatives Rosa DeLauro and Susan DelBene. Now, when we just isolate the impact of these expansions to the child tax credit, we see that there's about a 45% reduction in the rate of child poverty at the national level. We also see that it disproportionately benefits Black, Latino, and Native children, reducing the poverty rate among Black children by more than half. And that's because these groups were disproportionately left out of the credit to begin with. So we're seeing some significant reductions in the rate of child poverty associated with these expansions. In New York, the rate of the predicted reduction in child poverty is about 37%. You might wonder why is it a little bit lower than we're seeing at the national level? And that really has to do with the high cost of living in New York State that Chris mentioned earlier, and how that's part of poverty measurement, and how New York State has a higher poverty threshold, and areas of the state particularly high thresholds because of the high cost of living. But this really presents an opportunity for New York State to step in and address and expand and build on the impact of these reforms to the federal credit. If we could advance, please. So many states actually have their own child tax credit, and it's often linked to the federal credit. In New York, it's called the Empire State Child Credit. And, these kinds of policies are really important in high cost areas where the federal credit has less purchasing power. So, in thinking in that monthly framework, $250 per month buys a little bit less in New York State than it might buy in other areas. Now, the Empire State Child Credit, amounts to about exactly 33% of the federal credit, or $100 per child. So whichever is greater. But there are some real gaps in the ESCC under current law. So the first is that children under age 4 are entirely ineligible for this credit. And there are also limitations for children without Social Security numbers, as Megan was discussing, is also the case at the federal level. And just like the pre-American Rescue Plan federal credit, low-income families receive less from the Empire State credit than those with higher earnings. So kind of the distribution and gaps left in the former federal policy are really replicated at the state level with this additional exclusion of children under age 4. If we could advance the next slide, please. But there's a coalition of advocates, including CCC, who are really pushing for state lawmakers to build on the impact of the ARP by filling in those gaps left by the Empire State Child Credit, both ensuring that children without Social Security numbers are never excluded from these benefits, but also, remedying a lot of the gaps that came from being kind of coupled to the federal credit. So just last week, a bill was introduced in both the state Senate and Assembly that in the short term would provide a $500 per child credit annually to children over age 4 and up, and also $1,000 per credit for children under age 4. Now, in this tax filing year, it would cover children who were left out of the American Rescue Plan because of the because they might not have a social security number. But in the long term, the bill really aims to fix all of the problems in the Empire State Child Credit that we discussed beforehand, and kind of the gaps that are left under the current gaps that are left in the law on the books as it is today. And if we could advance, please. And this bill is really part of a broader effort to make reducing child poverty a state priority in New York State. Just this year, Senator Ramos introduced a bill at the New York State Senate that would establish an advisory council, a council on reducing child poverty at the state level. And they would really be tasked with making this a state priority and achieving certain targets in reducing child poverty. Now, just as reforming the child tax credit at the federal level plays a substantial role in reducing child poverty nationally, reforming the Empire State Child Credit really could play a substantial role in this effort at the state level. And I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, who is going to speak a little bit about also the opportunities and thoughts about how this could work in New York City.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here and just say, oh my gosh, hold on, my phone just rang. I'm going to jump in here and just say shout out to Schuyler Center for Advocacy, Analysis and Advocacy, who had started working on Empire State Child Credit reforms 2-3 years ago, and then the Robin Hood Foundation that really has really had an instrumental role in creating a statewide campaign with Schuyler to both draw attention to making sure that in any budget legislative process that the senators and assembly member actually assess the impact of decisions on the ability to reduce child poverty. And I think because they had such a long runway in the tax policy space, and there was a coalition already formed around how the Empire State Child Credit could be reformed prior to the stimulus passing, they were able to pivot really quickly and engage legislative champions in refining both those bills. So that is super exciting. There's a question here that you might want to speak to about why children under 4 were ever excluded in the state bill. You might not know the rationale, but you may be able to speak to the implications of it.
Yeah, the rationale is something I've long kind of tried to figure out and have never determined, because as most people know, investing in the early years is extraordinarily important. And so why that has not been a part of the Empire State Child Credit has been a mystery to me. But it also returns back to that point that those early years are very important, and the reform introduced last week, or the bill introduced last week, would actually provide an additional benefit to young children. So kids under 4 would receive $1,000 per year, while older children would receive $500. That's also true at the federal level, as Megan was discussing, in terms of the American Rescue Plan, where younger children would receive an annual credit amounting to $3,600 per child, while older kids, would receive $3,000 per year.
And I think what's exciting about this bill in particular is the way it's written. It would not only capture and provide benefit to the 73,000 children in New York left out of the federal reforms, but it also would make permanent these reforms of the state Empire tax credit should the federal reform not become permanent. So there's work to do, I think, at both the state and federal level. There's one more question here. Let me see if I can read it. This is a big one. How can you help explain the refundability with regard to the child tax credit? I don't know if someone wants to tackle that before we move on to Chris. If you can help people understand how it becomes fully refundable under this reform.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So the reason that, as I was explaining earlier, that the amount of a credit was tied to your earnings was because it was partial. The child tax credit before the American Rescue Plan was partially refundable. So if you had a tax liability, it could reduce that tax liability, and then you could receive part of it as a refund. But that part you could receive as a refund was capped at $1,400. Now, all that's much easier to explain with an example. So let's just say you had a child and you had a child who was, and you were eligible for, $2,000. We have one child who could have received a $2,000 child tax credit, but your tax liability was $200. You could receive a $200 as part of the credit to reduce your tax liability, and part of the remainder as a refundable credit, but the refundable part, the part you could receive as a cash refund, couldn't be more than 15% of your income. So it worked together to create this really complicated structure that left behind a lot of children because their family income was too low to reach that full credit. But I also will pass it over to anybody else who wants to provide a clearer explanation if they have, they would like to.
Just the implication of that is that the existing child tax credit tended to benefit more affluent families relative to lower income and more disadvantaged families because, it's more affluent, middle class, upper middle class families who have these tax liabilities, which would qualify them for the full $2,000 per child. And, more of the working poor families would only be able to claim up to $1,400 per child. So there was already inequity built in addition to the inequity that Sophie and Megan were talking about the people who didn't get the full credit that they were entitled to begin with. And so this full refundability piece is really trying to eliminate that and make sure that the people who would have only gotten less than the $2,000 per child are going to get the full amount of $3,000 per child or $3,600 per child for young children, regardless of earnings. So it's really sort of revamping and reforming the inequitable structure that existed before the American Rescue Plan.
And it's a great time to pivot to really think about what does all of this mean in relation to your work locally to measure poverty and the impact of policy on poverty reduction in New York City, since you won't only be looking at the implications of the child allowance, but looking at it in relation to the other things that poorer households might receive. So I wondered, Chris, if you might want to tackle a more local discussion, and I think we're going to switch to the next slide, Carlos.
Yeah, so I had mentioned earlier when I sort of provided a little introduction that we, in addition to looking at national anti-poverty policies and their effects, we also do a lot of work in New York City, again, primarily funded by the Robin Hood Foundation. And we run a study called the Poverty Tracker, which we've run since late 2012. And there we are interviewing, surveying a representative sample of New York City adults every 3 months and really tracking dynamics of poverty, but also so income poverty, but also other forms of hardship and well-being. So we look at material hardship, which is people's inability to meet their routine expenses, and then also just broader measures of economic and social well-being, things like health, assets and debt, neighborhood conditions, et cetera, like a whole wealth of information on families in New York City. And when you posed the question earlier of what are we going to be paying attention to going forward, we're going to, obviously be paying attention to these benefits going out the door, hitting families, bank accounts and pocketbooks, and making sure that that's accounted for in our monthly poverty framework. But then we're also trying to understand the actual impacts of these payments and the income that people receive on, economic stability, economic security, the experiences of economic hardship. And then, broader implications in terms of spending of the money, reductions in stress or reductions in psychological distress, et cetera. So this slide is just to show some, a quick bit of information from our poverty tracker survey from our most recent annual report that we released in February. And it doesn't show income poverty, but it shows material hardship. And like I said, that's people's actual inability to meet their routine expenses. So it's food hardship, food insecurity. So running out of money before, running out of food, I'm sorry, before there's more money to buy more. For housing, falling behind on rent, doubling up, staying in shelters, not being able to see a doctor because of costs, having your utilities shut off. So these are pretty acute and severe forms of hardship that we track. And you can see that, looking over the 4 years that we survey families in New York City, that there's a substantial fraction of New Yorkers who are experiencing these hardships and for whom we expect this income support to be really critical. And given the high cost of living in New York City, especially with regards to housing, we expect these income supports to be really critical. So we're going to be using the poverty tracker to understand, hopefully, the impacts that these payments are making in hopefully reducing these high levels of hardship. So you can see, around a third of Black and Latino New Yorkers are experiencing some sort of severe form of material hardship year after year. And we're really hopeful that these income, these child tax credit, child allowance payments will put a dent in some of these troubling statistics. And with the poverty tracker, because we're constantly in the field, we'll be able to sort of monitor this in real time or close to real time, to understand the impacts. And I guess just stepping back to what Megan said a little bit, real critical to all of this is understanding the actual implementation and making sure that families receive these benefits. And we'll be adding questions to our surveys to be able to track that, and we'll be following it really closely. But in terms of the political feasibility of making these kinds of reforms permanent, it's often thought that it's much harder to take these kind of benefits away once people sort of see them in their pocketbook and in their financial lives. But critical to that is people actually getting them while before these debates take place. So that's really the crux of what we're going to be looking at over time. And then just lastly, in New York, especially because of the high cost of living, I think there's real, as Sophie mentioned, real opportunity to sort of augment and bolster what's going on at the federal level to help people for whom like this credit is probably still not going to be, enough to really, afford living with children in New York City in a place with such high costs and high inequality.
So we had I have a question for you, but there was another question. I wondered when we look at the multiple things happening that lift incomes in the American Rescue Plan, and there was an estimate of like 5.5 million children lifted out of poverty. Do we have a sense when you do those projections of where their incomes were prior to being lifted out of poverty? Like, is that impacting, if you slice by race, ethnicity, is it impacting people primarily in the 100 to 200% of the federal poverty level, or do we not know? I just wonder what your projections, what granular detail on income levels, starting income levels, are you able to clarify?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely knowable. We really always are, we're a poverty research center, so we tend to be focused on, how supports lift people out of poverty. And as Megan said, it really depends on, the ordering as like which one's most important and what gets you from point A to point B. But yeah, I mean, these different programs operate at different points in the income distribution, so that, the child tax credit is delivering, or the reforms to the child tax credit are delivering, sort of the most income to the families with the very lowest income. So those in deep poverty, below half the poverty line, they're standing to gain the most probably from those reforms. Whereas things like the earned income tax credit, which is being expanded like around tripled for childless workers, that's still tied to earnings. And so that'll hit people probably closer, around the poverty line, a little bit less than the poverty line, to 100 to 150% of the poverty line. SNAP benefits tend to go to some of the most disadvantaged, so that will tend to focus on some of the most disadvantaged families. What we want to do in the future is provide some more like analyses of the relative changes in income from depending on where people start, and sort of show that kind of movement that you're talking about. But our analysis here is really focused on numbers of people sort of moved above this line. And obviously, any line is got a bit of arbitrariness to it.
Yeah, and I know on our part, we're really curious moving forward. God willing, the state reforms will happen, but we think locally as we move towards a new mayoral administration, there may be an appetite to think about how we might deepen the local earned income tax credit or revisit the structure and access to the child and dependent care credit here in New York City to see if the benefit could be made more robust and we could do a better job of making sure that people are aware of its availability and make use of it. I just wanted to ask Sophie, Megan, or Chris if you had any closing remarks before I kind of wrap up. But are there any thoughts you have? I think it's really, first of all, we're super excited that your work is out there. And I think that years of work at Columbia to really measure how multiple things impact household well-being and economic stability and mobility. It's like your time has come. You've like this wealth of information at the perfect time that I know we and many other people are going to draw on. So I wondered if you had any closing remarks before I close out.
The only thing we didn't mention, I mean, Sophie and Megan may have others, but another piece of this that we've tried to tackle is looking at like the long-term implications for children. So poverty is obviously like an immediate outcome, whether your income in a given year or a given month is above or below a line. But my co-director at the center, Irv Garfinkel, and a group of us have also tried to look at a comprehensive benefit cost analysis of turning the child tax credit into a child allowance and sort of looking at the most systematic, causal studies out there on the effects of income on a variety of outcomes, including, children's health, adults' health, involvement in the child welfare system, involvement in improvements in long-term earnings, et cetera. And, long story short, there's a quite long paper on that on our website, as well as some briefs. But the investment in making this permanent would yield long-term, both short and long-term, real benefits to families and society. So it's a longer discussion to describe all of the effects, but essentially the investment would pay for itself and then eightfold over the long run in terms of improvements, primarily driven through improvements in child health and child longevity and overall long-term outcomes for children. So, Megan and Sophie,
I don't know if you have anything to add.
One thing I'll just add is that we've a lot of it led by Sophie, and then Chris and Irv. We've done so much research in the center on what an expanded child tax credit could do for child poverty, in normal years and moving forward and things like that. But it's just, really important to highlight again that what we have in place right now is very temporary. And so, if we want to sort of see some of these child poverty reductions remain, in place, and set a new sort of lower baseline kind of for kids and families in the future. And hopefully means that, that everyone is better off. Then, a lot of people are talking about, what does this look like in the longer term? And so I'm imagining that, the kind of audience listening in right now, really obviously cares about kids as a number one priority. And so basically, if folks haven't been weighing in sort of with their representatives or senators, the kind of time to do so is now about what the child tax credit could look like permanently, or at least, for a few more years, even though it feels like a bit of whiplash because we just saw the passage of the American Rescue Plan and it's barely had time to get implemented. But the kind of conversations about what this could look like in the longer term are also happening sort of concurrently. And so it's a good time to be really engaged on this issue, but also for people who really care about the access and implementation, it's also a really good and important time. I'm imagining there's a lot of people who work directly with families and maybe know what are really useful ways for families to be able to access things and what are maybe not as helpful, like, with the realities of what families have in terms of technology and time and things like that. And so in addition to just helping families file taxes to claim this credit this year, there are ways to weigh in with the IRS. The Office of the Taxpayer Advocate is like one example of a sort of entry point. to actually kind of talk about from your own experiences of working directly with families, what maybe is useful to have to connect, non-filers to the credit. Maybe it's a sort of really easy to access website, online portal that the IRS can create. I think that voices of people who work directly with children and families themselves are really useful to lift up in this implementation phase. And so I would encourage you, to do so if possible.
Thanks. And Sophie, I don't know, do you have anything you want to add before I wrap up? Pressure.
No, I think one thing that was really interesting about this analysis is that the gaps, you kind of have to dig for them, but you can find really problematic structures within different policies when you dig into the details. And so in any sort of policy analysis of programs that either clients or that clients that people are interacting with, or just broader policy analysis, I think really understanding who's eligible, who's not, and who's being left out are some of the primary questions that should lead into that analysis, both when evaluating things like the CTC, but also the earned income tax credit and all of these other different tax credits and benefits that we know are really vital in reducing the rate of child poverty, but there are a lot of fixes that can be made, and those should be some key questions guiding those analyses.
Thanks. So I'm going to thank Chris, Megan, and Sophie for joining us today. I think you really have helped people joining us this evening better understand the implications of the American Rescue Plan and the nation as a whole. As I said earlier, I'm really excited to see your work in many of the news outlets, and it's going to be instrumental moving forward. I think that we all believe that the latest federal stimulus has a transformative opportunity to really combat child poverty, but there's a lot of important areas of advocacy that have been discussed this evening, and we need to be really focused on making sure we're building on these investments to make sure that no child or family is left behind. So first, the American Rescue Plan reforms will only last for 1 year based on the most recent stimulus package, so we have to continue working with Senator Schumer, our New York delegation, and other elected officials at the national level to make sure that the child allowance is made permanent, and I would add made more inclusive as well. Second, in the immediate, because the federal allowance leaves out many immigrant children who do not have a Social Security number, we need to work at the state level to help ensure that Senate 5866 and Assembly 3146 is part of the adopted budget. The budget is set to be adopted early April. Usually the deadline is April 1st. So we would encourage all of you to take action. And then finally, I think we have an opportunity to begin to explore how we might pursue the local tax policy vehicles to either deepen the earned income tax credit or improve the existing city child and dependent care credit, because the cost of living in New York, as we all know, is quite high, and those vehicles might be important vehicles to pursue to improve the ability to combat child poverty. And I would just say, I love the framing, Chris, that you mentioned about well-being. We too believe that it's not simply important to lift people out of poverty because having enough income to function in a city like New York is important, but we do know that when people have greater resources and access to a whole host of different things that anyone living, working, and raising a child in New York would benefit from, that child well-being and family well-being actually has long-term implications for health, education outcomes, and lifelong outcomes. So thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Don't forget to take action. And I would just say, stay tuned to CCC's emails, because we will circulate this webinar in blog form and try to embed within that blog different resources that child serving direct service organizations might avail themselves of to better understand this particular component of the stimulus bill and how they could actually support the children and families that they serve accessing the benefit. So thanks everyone, and have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you.